Today of all days. Don't say a word.
Okay. But why is it black?
Extra crispy, my favorite.
Have you figured out what day it is yet?
Of course, hon. Happy, anniversary?
No.
You know, back in my day.
Dad, not
Are you and Mom going to get a divorce? Also, what's a divorce? Also, what's a boomer? And why do you keep calling Grandpa one?
Oh, hey, hon. What a beautiful meal. And happy birthday.
Nope.
Yeah.
I was watching the news today, and you know.
Grandpa Street filling mashed potatoes again. Also, where do babies come from?
Well, hello again. We are in part 4 of a message series called Awkward Dinners, because sometimes dinners can be awkward. They can be uncomfortable. Hanging out with family, friends, or others, sometimes it gets a little tense and weird. And there's more to why we call awkward dinners, which I'll get to in a moment. But let me tell you, one of the many times dinner has been awkward for me. About 14 years ago, actually, as of last week, a buddy of mine got married. His name is Matt. And I was the best man in his wedding, and he was the best man in my wedding the year before. As part of being the best man, we planned this day together where we would first rent a Corvette convertible, which was awesome. I highly recommend that. That's not so much part of the dinner. But we drove into the city that evening to have dinner at this sushi place. And I had done my research to find a place that was not like crazy expensive, because we were about like 23 to 26, the 9 of us, like years old that is. We were 23 to 26. So like we were just coming out of college or still in college or having our first job. So we couldn't go like nuts with the expense. So I found this place and I was like, guys, if we do it right, we could get in and have dinner there in this great place for like $50 to $70 per person with tip. So we sit down at this restaurant, it's beautiful, we got a table, and the waiter comes by and I point to my buddy, I'm like, this guy's getting married tomorrow. I want you to bring him whatever, and I'll just take care of that, right? And he's like, you sure? I'm like, yes, just bring him whatever. And then the waiter goes to everyone else and asks them, okay, well, what do you want to order? And each one of them goes, we'll do the same thing. You just bring out whatever, and we'll just, eat. And I was like, you guys sure about this? They're like, yeah, it'll be great. So some time goes by, the waiter leaves, right, puts in the order, and then these enormous platters. I mean, dishes, I don't even think they made dishes this big. Just loaded up with like nigiri. That's like the lumps of rice with the raw fish on top. Things I have never even seen before were on these 3 enormous platters, and we were like, whoa, like colors you've never seen before at a sushi restaurant was on these dishes for us to eat. And we went to town, just eating and just like, oh my gosh, you gotta try this thing. I don't even know what it is. And we just ate and ate and ate, and we were like, oh my gosh, that was the best meal we've ever had. And it was. And then the bill came, and so I don't remember who grabbed the bill first, but they were like, all right, everyone guess how much they think it's gonna be. Dangerous game. One guy was like, $300. I was like, first of all, that math makes no sense. I said like 50 was the minimum per person times 9 is 450, like whatever. Somebody guessed like 500, 600. Well, it was $1,200. And which is actually not that crazy if you're like, oh, dinner Manhattan, that sounds pretty cool. Well, we were, again, 23 to 26. I think that was like the bill minus tip was like the equivalent of what I make in like 3 weeks of working at the time. And I'm just staring in complete disbelief at this bill. And I'm like, and then the guys are just looking at me like, what's he gonna do? And I was like, oh my gosh. And I realized I have to put this on my credit card. And the person who sees the credit card bill is my wife of 1 year. And I was like, this is not gonna end well. So I shakily put the credit card on the platter, like the thing, and like hand it to the guy. And everyone's like kind of like smiling and about to cry at the same time. We're like, what is going on? So the good news is, it was a very memorable night, but we didn't like savor every bite. Each bite was like $8, and we're just like, like they were Lay's potato chips, and we're just shoving them in our faces. But the good news is, we had a fantastic time. I'm still married to the same person. Somehow, she has been gracious. Yes, thank you. Yeah. I'm still paying off the credit card, but we had a good time. But that was one awkward dinner that I made happen. But the reason why we call this awkward dinners is that Jesus often found himself in situations where he's having a meal with people and it's tense, it's uncomfortable, and it's either because he said something that like set someone off, or somebody needs to say something and it just like you can feel the tension in the air. So these awkward dinners, oftentimes though, they reveal something very important about what God wants, not from us, but for us. And it's in these moments that we can learn these things. And we find them in the Gospel of Luke. We find many of these situations in the Gospel of Luke. Luke was an author, but originally he was a physician. He was a doctor. And he started hearing these things, 2,000 years ago about this guy named Jesus. And he was not a follower of Jesus. He was not one of his disciples originally. He wasn't even a Jewish person. He was a Gentile, a non-Jewish person, thinking like, okay, there's got to be something going on here. I keep hearing about this Jesus guy. And he started talking to eyewitnesses and actual disciples of Jesus. And he decided to write these things down and keep an account of what Jesus was all about. And he became a Christian, a Jesus follower. Somebody who based their life around this guy Jesus. And he records these meals because when Jesus sat down with people, and sometimes this is the case for us today, what you're basically saying is like, we're good, we're cool. We often don't have dinners with people we absolutely can't stand, except for when it's like Thanksgiving. And Jesus would sit down with people and people would be like, whoa, I didn't think he would do this. And he's like, no. Like, we're all good. And that's kind of the idea. So we've been saying this, that every time Jesus has one of these meals, he's making room at the table for the people there, whether they be religious or not, whether they be righteous or not, whether they believed or acted the same way he did or not. In week 1, there was a situation where Jesus was invited by Levi, who became Matthew, the gospel writer, and he was a tax collector. And this tax collector said, Jesus, why don't you come over to my place? Let's have a big banquet. I'll invite all sorts of other people in society that are also like tax collectors, and they're wealthy. But here's the thing, tax collectors in that society, it was a Jewish community, they were despised, they were hated because they collected taxes on behalf of the Roman Empire, which that whole area was under in terms of rule. And so these tax collectors would collect taxes for Rome and keep a portion for themselves. That was their income. And it was very, very lucrative. And to their fellow Jewish people, look at these tax collectors like, you're betraying us. And they would despise them and push them away and treat them like outcasts in society. But Jesus gets invited to one of these guys' houses. And he's there and he's eating. And he's having a fantastic time with these people. And there are Pharisees and other people looking in going, can you believe this rabbi, this Jewish teacher would sit down with these sinners and worse, these tax collectors? And in that moment, Jesus demonstrated something incredible. He demonstrated radical acceptance. That he would eat with these people. He would be seen with these people who are not like him. These people that were outcasts, were sometimes taking advantage of their own people for their own personal gain. He would sit down with them and say, you know what? I don't define you based on your actions or your profession. I accept you despite what you have done. You're cool with me. He was showing them grace. Grace. Unmerited, unearned favor. And that was difficult. That was very difficult for those looking in. And in week 2 of this series, Lou looked at a passage where actually Jesus is invited by one of these Jewish leaders, a Pharisee named Simon. And Simon invites him to his home, and Jesus goes, and he's at the table with Simon and other members of the religious leadership. And a woman walks in, and she goes up to Jesus, who is like reclined at the table, and she starts to cry and weep, and her tears fall on his feet, and she starts to wipe his feet with her hair, and then she pours perfume on his feet, and she's just broken and just crying out. And the Pharisee, Simon's just thinking, if this Jesus guy were truly a man of God, if he were a prophet, if he could see or know what I know, he would know who this person is. This sinner woman, this outcast of society, this person who is, her profession, her lifestyle is gross. He would have nothing to do with her. And Jesus doesn't dismiss the woman, nor does he dismiss Simon. And he says to her, I forgive you. Your sins do not define you. My acceptance does. And in that moment, he demonstrates extreme forgiveness. Because for a lot of people, what she did, what her life was about, was unacceptable, completely unacceptable. You would not want anything to do with her. But Jesus forgives and welcomes her in. And same goes for that Pharisee. Because he thought he belonged at the table. He thought like, yeah, I'm supposed to be right next to Jesus. I'm a Jewish teacher. He's a Jewish teacher. We're on the same page here. And Jesus is like, no, you don't really understand. All are welcome, but no one deserves a seat. You are here because of my goodness, not because of anything you could do on your own. And last week, we looked at a passage where Jesus, once again, at somebody's house for dinner, for a meal. And the house was the sisters of Lazarus, one of Jesus' closest friends. The two women, the sisters, are Martha and Mary. And Martha, in excitement and wanting to make this a big deal, she immediately starts to prepare this meal. And she goes away and starts trying to cook and take care of things, while her sister seems to be of no help to Martha. And she's just at the feet of Jesus in the home and taking in the things that he has to say. And she's listening like a disciple, listening, taking it in like a student. And Martha comes in and is like, Jesus, could you tell my sister to help me out here? I'm over here like making this grand meal and she's just what? Just sitting there? Tell her to help me out. And he goes, Martha, compassionately, Martha, there are so many things you could be doing right now, but Mary has chosen the better one. In fact, the best, the most good one. See, you're so concerned about all of this stuff that you have to do for me. But the most important thing, the most essential thing right now is just to know who I am. Learn from me. And this is where the church messes things up. We so badly oftentimes want people to understand God that we tell them what you need to do is you need to obey. You need to obey. Just do the things that God says and you'll see how good he is. When Jesus is like, no. That comes later in the sequence. It's hard for people to obey somebody they don't trust. And it's hard to trust someone they don't know. So Jesus is like, do what Mary did. Sit and learn and listen. Come to know who I am, because then you will trust me. And then naturally, you'll come to obey. What you find in all of these different stories is that, maybe not so much this the third week, but oftentimes there are these Pharisees, these religious leaders, who just seem to be like the enemy, the villain in these stories. Like, Jesus is constantly like, yo, you're not getting it right. I need you to change your ways. Like, you're supposed to lead the people, but you're not doing a great job, and it's making me really concerned. And we have to ask the question, well, what's wrong with these people? What's the problem with these people? Jerry Seinfeld, what's the deal with these people? Sorry. What's going on with these Pharisees? What is it that keeps causing them to bump heads with Jesus? Why does Jesus keep confronting them? What are they doing or not doing that is the issue here? And how can we avoid becoming like them? Because sometimes the tendency, the pull in a religious system, even within Christianity, is that the people on the inside start to set up things to be protecting all of the good that they have found at the expense of those on the outside. And Jesus was trying to confront that in them. He's like, this is not simply just for you. This hope, this goodness that you have found, it's not just meant for you. It's meant to be given away to everyone. So if you're not a Christian, if you're not a Jesus person, and you're like, I have a lot of distrust when it comes to thinking about the church or organized religion as a whole, I often see, like, it just seems like it's set up in a way that benefits those at the top and is often hurting those not. Like, it's helping those in leadership, but it's not serving the folks who are there. In fact, they're being sometimes used and abused. If that's you, if you're skeptical about those things, this is a good message for you, because Jesus is going to take this stuff like right on. He's going to have this big confrontation with these religious leaders. So let's just jump right into the text with the time that we have left. So it starts here in Luke 11. So we're getting to like the heart of Jesus' ministry. He's doing a lot. And it says that when Jesus had finished speaking, that is, teaching like he normally does to large crowds of people, different groups, revealing who God is, what he's about, what he wants for humanity. When he had finished speaking, a Pharisee, one of these leaders, invited to eat with him. Like, he either respected Jesus as a fellow teacher, appreciated the things that he had to say, and he's like, you know what, Jesus, why don't you come on over? Let's sit down. Let's break bread together. I want to hear more about these things that you are saying. And I'm going to invite some of my friends over too, because we like to have a dialogue. You see, the Pharisees, for all of their faults, they were learners. They wanted to know more about God. So the story continues. Jesus, he went in and reclined at the table. So he goes to this person's house and sits. But the Pharisee was surprised when he noticed that Jesus did not first wash before the meal. Now, at first glance, it might feel like, oh, that's like when somebody comes over to your house and doesn't take off your shoes when they enter, and they just start like walking through the house. In my house, we're shoe take-off people. And occasionally somebody will come over and I'll just like watch them walk. I'm like, okay, that's one way to live. But this wasn't a sanitary thing. Simply like, listen, you just gotta make sure there's just no dirt on your hands before the meal. This was kind of larger than that. But this wasn't a law. This wasn't part of the Jewish commandments. No one was commanded, you must wash your hands before the meal. It's a good idea, right? Fine. We tell our kids to wash their hands before meals all the time. But for them, for these Pharisees, what they did was they saw that people could defile themselves, could become ceremonially unclean if they had touched something in the world that was offensive to God. It could be a dead animal. It could be they sat down and shook hands with a known sinner, or something to that effect, where now like they have to go through a ritual process to become clean again so they can go to God undistorted, unpolluted by the world. So there was a line that was being crossed when they got defiled, but for the Pharisees, they started to put in place guardrails so that they would never even come close to breaking the law. Does that make sense? So like they were like, okay, well, the law is here, but let's do this so that we can never even come close to there. But the problem was they started to elevate these rules that they put together that were meant for good to a very high place. They elevated into almost the equivalent of the law itself, and they started to judge others based upon their adherence, not to simply the law, but these new man-made customary rules. And this was one of them. Jesus, knowing that there is this guardrail there that he should wash his hands, just goes, steps around it and just sits down at the table. And the Pharisees are like, oh, okay. Now we don't know if he was just simply surprised or perhaps offended by Jesus' actions, but he picks up on it. And it says that the Lord said to him, now then, let's talk about this. Let's get this out in the open. And he says, you Pharisees, you religious leaders, you clean the outside of the cup and dish. You work to make sure that the dish and the cup are presentable, that they look great, that the outside is polished, it's shiny, everything's great from the outside. And then he mixes metaphors and he says this, but inside you are full of greed and wickedness. This is exactly what you want to hear from an invited guest. What he's saying here is, you got things kind of out of order. You're so focused on the outside. You're so focused on making sure things are presentable that you've neglected what's going on the inside. You would never hand a cup to somebody, a guest that you care about, a glass of water where it's spotless on the outside, but on the inside it's just full of gunk and stuff. You wouldn't do that. Why are you doing that with your own lives? You're hyper-fixated on the outside, but the inside is a mess. It's revolting. You extort the people, the Jewish people that you're supposed to care for your own gain. That's the greed. Instead of being agents of good, you're the opposite of that. You're making things harder and worse for people. You're wicked. What he's saying to them is this: you have all the appearance of good, but none of the substance. Everyone looks at you and goes, wow, man, those guys have it together. And that feels good to you. But the truth is, you don't. It's all smoke and mirrors. It's a facade. It's a mask. It's not real because the inside of you is all broken and busted. But you keep putting on all the makeup to make things look perfect when indeed it's not. And Jesus says to them, you foolish people, as in you blind leaders. You know the whole of the story so far. You have been studying this all your lives. Don't you know? Did you not know that the one who made the outside made the inside also? You've heard this before. This is a theme running through all of the ancient texts that we study and love so much. That God's constantly like, your actions are trying to honor me, but your hearts are far from me. You do things to try to make me pleased with you, but your hearts are full of garbage. You can't stand helping folks. You just do everything you can to make yourselves look okay, keep a right standing with me, but you neglect the people. Don't you know that God made both the outside and the inside? Don't you remember when we had to select, the nation of Israel had to select a new king to replace King Saul? That Samuel, this prophet, this man of God, went before these group of sons and was like, let's pick the biggest, strongest one. And God said, no, Samuel. People look on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. You know these stories. Why do you think that you can just worry about the outside and totally neglect the inside? And he continues and he says, but now, as for what's inside you, how do we address this? I said you're full of greed and wickedness. How do you fix this? I want you to be generous to the poor, and everything will be made clean for you. The idea is like, you want to undo some of this? Start taking care of those. Start being a blessing to those who can never repay you. It'll really change the way you are. Because right now, everything you're doing is to make sure that you look good or that people scratch your back after you scratch theirs. And what I'm saying to you is, no. Start helping folks who can never come close to repaying you with good the way that you could pay and treat them. Be generous to the poor. And then, perhaps, it'll do some surgery on your heart and you will not have to worry about the outside. It'll take care of itself. And what Jesus is saying here is that he wants them to investigate and invest within. Take a look at the inside. Stop worrying about what people think about the outside. God sees the outside, but he also sees the inside. What's going on there? And then start investing in it. Do good for those who can't pay you back. Because if you only do good for those who can pay you back, you're just trying to get a return on the favor. You're trying to get a return on the investment. He's like, Be generous the way God has been generous to you. He's not asking for you to do anything back for him. So at this point, I am certain that the Pharisee that invited Jesus was like, I just wanted to see if you wanted to wash your hands, man. Like, we're going to eat and we're going to use our fingers and stuff. Do you want to just get the dirt out from under your nails? I got Purell. I got plenty of Purell. We could just, you don't have to use water. Just do the Purell. And he's like, oh man, like, this is not what I was expecting. And the good news is that Jesus wasn't done yet. In fact, Jesus was like, okay, I don't know if you're getting the whole of the picture. I don't think you guys understand how serious this is. And he begins to like really go after them and really be hard on them. And he says some very strong things. And every time he says something, he begins with this phrase, woe to you. It's a warning. He's like, woe to you. Like, slow down. Take a pause. Realize what's going on here. And then he just launches into this thing after thing. He says, you Pharisees, woe to you, warnings to you, because you give a tenth of your mint, your rue, and all kinds of gardeners. Like, when you are instructed to give, which the law, it said that, you do it perfectly, precisely, like exactly, because you want to make sure you don't break the law. But you neglect justice and the love of God. You should have been practicing the latter, this part, without leaving the former undone. Like, you could have done both. You could have been exacting with making sure you don't break the law, but also taking care of people. That's what you're there for ultimately. Not to be like, look, we did it, we achieved it, we're in great shape, we've made God pleased with our behavior. But rather, there's folks you're supposed to be helping and leading, and they're hurting and they're lost. And he continues. Warnings to you Pharisees, woe to you, because you love the most important seats in the synagogues and respectful greetings in the marketplace. He's like, there are sometimes advantages that come with leadership, and you love it. You love it so much. You've got to be careful. This is a dangerous game to be playing. And he continues, as this one is like super offensive. This one's been a punch in the gut. Woe to you, because you are like unmarked graves, which people walk over without knowing it. He's like, people are supposed to be coming to you. You're supposed to provide them with answers to life. You're supposed to help them walk out this life in a way that is beautiful and meaningful, because the people of God, they were lost. They were enslaved in Egypt, and the law was given them to help them be a free people. But you know what you've done? You've not made it free, you've made it poisoned. You've taken what was supposed to be their good, and when they approach you and they come to you, know what they get? Not health, not life, not instructions to be a whole good person, not just for themselves, but for the community. They touch you, they come near you, and they become defiled. They become unwell, and they don't even know it. In another book, in the book of Matthew, that guy Levi we were talking about earlier, Jesus says, you're hypocrites. You wear a mask. You're dead on the inside. And he says something even more offensive. If you're familiar with a mausoleum, like at Pine Lawn Cemetery, it's like this structure that houses, the remains of people. He's like, you're like that. You're like whitewashed tombs where people have worked so hard to make this exterior absolutely beautiful. But don't forget what's inside. Dead, rotting bones. That's what you guys are like. When people come in contact with you, they're like, ooh, look how fancy. Ooh, they got everything going on. But really, there's just death. That's who you are. So one of the buddies of this Pharisee, he's not a Pharisee. He wasn't one of the leaders, but he was a lawyer. He was an expert in the law. And he's like, man, I am so glad I am not a Pharisee. But I have to say, Jesus, I feel like you're getting awfully close to us. This is what it says. One of the experts in the law spoke up and responded to him. Teacher, Jesus, when you say these things, you insult us also. Like, be careful, man. I feel like you're trying to gun for us too. And Jesus is like, oh, good. I'm glad you said something. So it continues. He says, Jesus replied, and you, experts in the law, you lawyers, you people who are supposed to be studying these things and making it easy for people to understand. Do you know what you do? Warnings to you, because you load people down with burdens they can hardly carry, and you yourselves will not lift one finger to help them. That law that was given to be helpful, to make these people who are enslaved free, to prevent them from becoming sick and hurting and destructive. You have made it so cumbersome that the law and all these extra rules you're putting on it are crushing people under the weight, and you don't help. How dare you? He continues, you experts in law, actually, I don't have this next slide up, but the next one he's like, and let's not talk about all the prophets that your ancestors murdered, that you built tombs to. There weren't tombs and monuments to the prophets. You built it to the murdering ones, the ones who killed the prophets. Like, you didn't care about the message they were bringing. You neglected it. You actually threw away their message. But here's the thing. A prophet is going to be sent to you, and you're going to treat him the same way, and you'll be judged for it. Basically saying, look, God's sending a prophet, me, Jesus, to you right now, and you're going to miss the message. Please wake up. This is a warning call. Woe to you. And then he continues with this last one and says, warning to you experts in the law, because you've taken away the key to knowledge. This beautiful law that was meant to help, you've taken it away, and you yourselves have not entered using this key, and you've hindered those who are trying to enter. You're supposed to be a guide, and you are just as blind as everyone else, and you're making them worse off. So how do you think they responded? Do you think they were like, oh, goody, thank you, Jesus. I'm so glad I came to lunch. This was so helpful to me. I really see the light. I was lost, but now I'm found. Unfortunately, no. These guys totally reject and make true what Jesus said to them about rejecting the prophet. It says this, when Jesus went outside, the Pharisees and the teachers of the law began to oppose him fiercely and to besiege him with questions, waiting to catch him in something he might say. They were hoping at some point Jesus would say something completely heretical so they could capture him in that moment and be like, this guy is a heretic. Let's excommunicate him at a minimum, or let's get Rome to kill him. Eventually, that's kind of what took place. But you have to remember, Luke, he's writing to a Gentile audience. Yeah, we're talking about Jewish law and Jewish practices and this rabbi who's trying to make sense of it all for Jesus, and trying to make sense of it all for everyone. But the message that Luke is trying to communicate to his Gentile, non-Jewish audience is simply this. The religious crowd, not just simply the leaders, not just simply the teachers of the law, but the religious crowd, sometimes they just don't get it right. And I don't want you to equate their shortcomings, their misgivings, their failings as the heart of God. I don't want you to see them and think that they're always perfect representatives of what God is about, because they're human. And they were supposed to take this law and build it in such a way, and put it together in such a way as to be a service unto the people, to help and serve and guide the Jewish people, but they haven't. They've made a mess of things, and they've built up a structure that only ensures that they get to keep and preserve and protect the advantages and the good that they have found. And that's not how it's supposed to be. And that message is the same for us today. If you are here and you're like, yeah, I want to stay as far away from organized religion because I often feel like the leaders take advantage of it and they're just building their own little empires. Yeah, that has happened many times throughout history. It still sometimes happens today, unfortunately, and I don't want you to equate those people with the character and the heart of God. That's what Luke is saying to those who are not Christians, those who are far from believing these things. We understand, and on behalf of our church and other churches, we're sorry that we're not perfect. We will make mistakes. But don't give up on Jesus because of something I do or somebody in the church does. But there's more. To those who are followers of Jesus, those who are Christians who have decided, you know what, I'm with this Jesus guy. I want to be all about that life. Like, I want to follow after him. There's a message for us too. And that is, you need to be careful, because religion and religiosity and legalism will often lead people to set things up in such a way as to protect what they have at the expense of those on the outside. And the only way to prevent yourself from becoming like a Pharisee who misses the mark with all of the good entrusted to them is to do this. It's what Jesus said. It's to investigate and invest within. To pay attention to what's going on in the inside. If there's a discrepancy between how you look to everyone else and how you really are, there's a problem that needs to be dealt with. So I have a question for you, and the question is this: what is the state of your heart? What's going on the inside that no one but you and God sees? Like, you know, you might have all of the affectations and all of this stuff put together, so people go, wow, they're so blessed, they're so well put together, but on the inside you're riddled with doubt, with guilt, with addiction, but yet you present a facade that is believable, but really you know that God is like, something needs to change on the inside. Will you pause and not miss the things that Jesus is trying to teach these Pharisees, and investigate and really look into what's going on inside you? I have a couple of statements that might help clarify. They're not meant to just offend. They're meant to, like, hopefully stir up some change. If you've ever worried more about what the impact of a growing church might have on your social life than the fact that people are coming to church, like if you're more concerned about losing your seat or your parking spot than you are the fact that there are people on the outside coming to church, you might want to pay attention to that. Have you ever felt like you had to show up and pretend that everything is okay when you arrive to a group of Christians, when you're hanging out with them or you come to church and you feel like, oh yeah, God's just blessing me, but really you're like, no. On the inside, you're screaming like, I am so fed up with faith. I'm so fed up with church. I can't stand all that stuff, but you have to put on a mask. Pay attention to what's going on in your heart. And I want to challenge all of us, myself included, to pray a prayer that actually came from King David, the second king of Israel, after he had made a total mess of the kingdom and a total mess of his own personal life. And God still somehow redeemed him. He wrote these words. He said, "Search me, God, and know my heart. Look in. Test me. Like really get in there. Probe. Find out what's going on and know my anxious thoughts, my worries, my struggles, my problems, the things I can't let go of, the people I can't stand. Know what's going on inside of me. Not just the outside, because everyone else can see that. But you, God, you can see through all of it. And then he continues and ends with this. He says, see if there's any offensive way in me. Is there something in me that is just rotten to the core, that needs to be removed? And lead me in the way everlasting. Help me get back to the way of life that brings life to me and to others. Would you pray this prayer? Would you investigate and invest within? Because here's the thing. Yes, Jesus made room for the sinner woman. He made room at the table for Martha and for Mary. And he made room for the Pharisees like Simon in the other stories. But he also made room at the table for the Pharisees who thought they had it all together but didn't, because Jesus knew who they were before he ever accepted. He sat down with them saying, there's room for all of the honest sinners out there, but if you're willing as a hypocrite to admit that you've been faking it, that there's something wrong on the inside, there's room at my table for you as well. So Christians, there's room for you and I, and we don't have to be fake because he welcomes us just like he welcomes everyone.